The midday Texas heat was brutal. Dust clung to the skin and rose in clouds with every boot step around the dark wooden arena. The auction dragged on, horses brought in and out, eyes scanning, murmured bids tossed like loose change. Then came a new horse through the gates. Caked in mud, stumbling, his head hanging low like he'd forgotten what pride was, the animal stepped in and collapsed. The crowd let out a mix of laughter and disgust. Some turned their heads. But one man didn't move. Off to the side, in a worn-out wheelchair dulled by age and use, Harlan Creed gripped the armrests tightly. His eyes locked on the horse. Once a legend in the world of horse training, Harlan now looked like a ghost of himself, except for his eyes. He saw something in that animal, buried under filth and fatigue. A curve in the neck. A faint white mark on the forehead. A chill ran down his spine. "It can't be," he whispered. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing from the fallen horse to the audience. "This one won't last another week," someone scoffed. But Harlan raised his hand, voice steady, almost surprising himself. "I want him." Silence. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. A younger man muttered, "What for?" "To bury." But Harlan didn't respond. Or if he did, he didn't care. He was staring at the horse like he was watching a ghost rise from the past. Then the name hit him like a punch. Mournridge. A horse he and his late wife Evelyn had raised with love and care. Lost 12 years ago in a flood. He'd wept like a child that night. Losing Evelyn just months later only deepened the wound. Mournridge was the last living memory of her. And now, that mud-covered animal was looking back at him with the same old soul in its eyes. There was no doubt in his heart. As the handlers tried to pull the horse upright, Harlan blinked hard, holding back emotion. Evelyn's face flashed in his mind, kneeling beside a newborn foal, whispering, "This one has a soul, Harlan. He'll teach you something." He swallowed. Maybe life was giving him one final chance to understand what she meant. At that moment, no one in the arena could have guessed it, but that horse's fall in the dust wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something that would unearth old truths, test broken hearts, and rewrite the meaning of what was truly lost. The ride back to the Creed ranch was quiet. The horse trailer rattled behind the pickup truck, but inside the cab, only the hum of tires on gravel filled the silence. Tucker Holloway, arms crossed and jaw tense, kept his eyes on the road. He hadn't spoken to his grandfather in weeks, and now here he was, driving him home after some impulsive act of lunacy at a horse auction. "A bag of bones covered in mud," he muttered under his breath. "And you spent money we don't have." In the passenger seat, Harlan Creed sat motionless, staring straight ahead. His voice, when it finally came, was low and certain. It wasn't just any horse. At the ranch, the air smelled of dry hay, sun-warmed wood, and memories. The barn hadn't seen fresh paint in years. Its faded red walls stood like weary sentinels from another time. Tucker opened the trailer gate with a frustrated grunt, watching as the weak horse stepped down with wobbling legs. He expected it to collapse again. But something about being on the ranch seemed to stir the animal. Its ears perked slightly. Its head lifted. Harlan watched from the porch ramp, silent and still. "Put him in Evelyn's stall," he said. Tucker froze, visibly irritated. "That's been closed since she died." Harlan didn't respond. Just turned his wheelchair slowly and rolled back inside the house. That night, Tucker couldn't sleep. He sat on the old porch swing, staring out into the dark. The stars were clearer out here, but they didn't calm him like they used to. He remembered being 10 years old, Evelyn's hand on his shoulder, pointing out constellations. She was the warmth in this place. After her death, everything had turned cold. Especially Harlan. "You should have let that horse go," he said out loud to no one. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about the horse. In the barn, Mournridge stood alone in his stall, barely touching the feed Tucker had left. A shaft of moonlight broke through a crack in the roof, illuminating the dust in the air. The horse shifted slightly, his body still weak but his eyes more alert. In the next stall over, a faded leather halter with the name Mournridge hung on a rusty nail. It hadn't been touched in over a decade. Inside the house, Harlan stared at an old photo on the wall, Evelyn holding a foal in her arms, her smile bright as morning. His fingers traced the glass. "You were right," he whispered. "He came back." But what he didn't say, not yet, was that the horse's return might also bring back something far more dangerous than memories. Something he'd buried long ago. Morning came with a sharp wind and pale light stretching over the dried fields. The ranch, once alive with the noise of hooves and early chores, now stirred only with quiet steps and aging wood creaking under the weight of time. Tucker walked into the barn carrying a bucket of oats. His boots scraped against the concrete floor as he glanced toward Mournridge's stall. To his surprise, the horse was standing on his own, head slightly lifted, nostrils flaring at the scent of fresh feed. "You're still breathing," Tucker muttered, half in relief, half in disbelief. As he poured the feed, something caught his eye. The halter. The one with Mournridge engraved into the worn leather. He hadn't noticed it the night before. It was old, coated in dust, the brass nameplate dulled by time. He stepped closer, lifting it gently from the nail. The weight of it in his hand made his chest tighten. This can't be," he whispered. The name didn't just confirm the horse's identity. It dragged up every question he'd been trying not to ask since the auction. Tucker stormed into the house, the halter in hand. Harlan sat by the window, staring out at the fields. "You knew it was him," Tucker said, the accusation hanging in the air like smoke. Harlan didn't turn. "I knew the moment he fell," he replied, calm but distant. "The way he moved. The scar under his right eye. That horse was born here." Tucker's hands clenched around the leather strap. "You told me he died. That the flood swept him away." Harlan finally looked up, his eyes tired. "That's what I believed. Or what I wanted to believe." Later that afternoon, Tucker went searching through the loft above the tack room. Dust filled his lungs as he opened old crates, photos, tools, letters, brittle with age. In the bottom of a box marked E.H., he found something wrapped in faded linen. Unfolding it, he revealed a stack of documents, ownership records, vet bills, and a transfer of sale, dated 6 months after the flood, signed in someone else's handwriting. The buyer, Rhett Crowley. Tucker stood still, the barn silent around him except for the rustle of old paper in his hands. He read the name again. Rhett Crowley. His grandfather's friend. The man who owned the auction. A man who'd always been around. Too close, maybe. Something about it didn't sit right. Why would Mournridge have been sold, if he was believed to be dead? Behind him, Mournridge gave a soft snort, as if echoing the unease. The past wasn't just returning, it was knocking, loud and deliberate. Tucker sat on the barn steps long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, the documents sprawled across his lap. Crickets sang in the distance, but his mind was too loud to hear them. The transfer papers felt heavier than they should have. His grandfather had sworn Mournridge was lost in the flood. But this was proof someone had lied. And it wasn't just about a horse. It was about trust. About a history someone tried to rewrite. He stared at the signature again. Rhett Crowley. A name that had always been spoken like family. Inside the house, Harlan stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window, hands motionless on the rim. The past was beginning to stir like a storm behind his ribs. He knew Tucker had found something. He could see it in the way the boy avoided his eyes. That halter, those papers, it was all coming back, faster than he could brace for. He closed his eyes. There had been choices back then. Desperate ones. And secrets kept to protect a legacy, or so he told himself. The next morning, Tucker drove into town alone. The local diner, still run by Marge after 30 years, was quiet as ever. He slid into a booth and ordered coffee, but his eyes were fixed on the truck parked outside, Rhett Crowley's F-150. A part of him wanted to storm in and demand answers. But another part, the part that remembered Rhett at every family barbecue, giving him rides on his shoulders as a kid, hesitated. Could that same man really be part of something so underhanded? Back at the ranch, Mournridge was slowly regaining strength. Briar Knoxfield had arrived that morning, called by Harlan himself. Her gentle voice and firm hands worked wonders. She cleaned his wounds, checked his legs, and whispered something only the horse could hear. Harlan watched from a distance, remembering when Briar was just a girl, running wild through the pasture with Tucker. So much had changed. And yet, here they all were, back in the same soil, haunted by the same horse. Later that day, Tucker confronted Harlan again, not with rage this time, but with something quieter. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, laying the transfer paper on the table. Harlan's eyes didn't leave the page. His voice cracked just slightly. "Because I thought I'd lost everything that night. Your grandmother. The horse. You stopped coming around after that." Tucker hesitated. "I stopped because I thought you stopped caring." For the first time in years, silence didn't mean distance between them. It meant something else, the weight of words finally spoken, and a shared ache neither had dared to name. But they both knew this was only the beginning. And Rhett Crowley had answers neither of them were ready to hear. The gate creaked as Tucker stepped onto Rhett Crowley's property. The Crowley ranch was bigger, cleaner, and somehow colder than he remembered. It had grown over the years, new barns, white fences, satellite dishes. But the heart of it felt hollow. He saw Rhett near the stables, talking to a couple of buyers. Dressed in his usual polished boots and crisp button-down, the man didn't look like someone with dirty secrets. But Tucker's grip tightened on the folder in his hand. He wasn't here for pleasantries. Rhett turned, smiling at first, until he saw Tucker's face. "Tucker," he said, tone cautious. "Didn't expect to see you out here." Tucker didn't waste time. He handed over the transfer document. "You sold Mournridge 12 years ago. After the flood. After my grandfather told me he was gone." Rhett's eyes flicked down to the paper, his jaw tightening slightly. For a moment, he looked older. "That horse wasn't supposed to come back," he muttered under his breath. There was a long pause. Tucker didn't move. Finally, Rhett exhaled. "Your grandfather brought that horse to me," he said quietly. "After the flood. He was injured, badly. Vet said he wouldn't last a week. Harlan couldn't bring himself to put him down, so he left him with me. Said it was better this way." Tucker's heart thudded in his chest. "So he lied to everyone? Including himself?" Rhett looked away. He was grieving. Evelyn had just died. The ranch was bleeding money. Mournridge reminded him of everything he lost. Back at the Creed ranch, Harlan sat beside Mournridge's stall, a folded photo in his hand. It was one he hadn't looked at in years, Evelyn smiling with the young foal. His fingers trembled as he held it. He could still hear her voice, still feel the warmth of her touch on his shoulder that morning, the morning before the flood, when everything still made sense. He hadn't just lost her that day. He'd lost himself. And in trying to bury the pain, he'd buried the truth. When Tucker returned that evening, the air between them was heavier than usual, not angry, but dense with things unsaid. "He told me," Tucker said softly. Harlan didn't ask who. He only nodded. "I thought I was protecting you," he murmured. Tucker looked at his grandfather, and for the first time saw the fragility in him, not in his body, but in his heart. Neither of them spoke again that night. But Mournridge did, not with words, but with a deep, steady breath as he lay in his stall, no longer broken, but watching, waiting, as if he knew that what was coming next would break more than silence. A cold wind pushed through the rafters of the barn as Harlan sat in his office, flipping through an old leather-bound ledger. The pages were brittle, stained with time and coffee, but the handwriting was unmistakably his. Line after line of feed orders, vet bills, training schedules, until he found the entry he was dreading. Mournridge, scribbled in rushed ink, dated weeks after Evelyn's funeral. The words were simple, transferred to R. Crowley, temporary. Harlan stared at the word temporary like it was a blade. Outside, Tucker watched as Briar finished checking Mournridge's leg bandages. The horse had stopped trembling. His ribs still showed, but his eyes had changed, clearer now, more present. Briar stood and wiped her hands. "He's responding faster than I expected," she said. "He remembers this place. Horses don't forget safety." Tucker nodded, unsure how to say what was circling in his chest. "He was never just a horse, was he?" Briar looked at him carefully. "He's a mirror. Whatever you're hiding, he reflects it." Later that day, Tucker drove back into town. His visit to the courthouse had been short, but what he'd found there wasn't. Land records, loan defaults, and something worse, a lien on the Creed ranch filed 5 years ago, signed by Sterling Drax, a name he barely remembered, but one that would come to matter. Drax was an investor, and that lien gave him legal leverage to seize the land if Harlan missed another payment. Tucker returned to the ranch in silence, dread clawing at him. He found Harlan by the fireplace, nursing a black coffee. "Did you take a second loan on the land?" he asked, holding out the file. Harlan didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, "After Evelyn died, the costs were too much. I thought I could recover. Thought maybe if I rebuilt things, brought the bloodline back," he trailed off. Tucker sat down across from him, voice low. "You gambled everything, and never told me." That night, thunder rolled in the distance. Mournridge stirred uneasily in his stall. Rain tapped on the tin roof, a sound that used to soothe Harlan, but now only brought back the night of the flood. As lightning flashed, he saw a silhouette at the edge of the property. A truck. Headlights off. Watching. Inside, Tucker laid awake, the documents spread across the table. Mournridge's return wasn't just emotional. It was financial, legal, dangerous. And someone else knew. Someone who had waited 12 years for the right moment to take what remained. And now they were almost here. By morning, the ground was soaked and the air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and uncertainty. Tucker woke early, unable to shake the image of the truck from the night before. It hadn't been a coincidence. He stepped out onto the porch, coffee steaming in his hands, and scanned the tree line beyond the pasture. Nothing moved, but the silence felt wrong, like the breath held before a punch. Inside, Harlan was already dressed, boots laced, eyes sharper than usual. "Someone's watching," he said without looking up. Tucker didn't ask how he knew. In town, word had started to spread. Mournridge was back. Not everyone believed it. Some called it impossible, a trick of an old man's memory. But others remembered the Creed bloodline, the horse that had once outrun every colt in the county. Rhett Crowley hadn't said a word, but people had noticed how quickly he'd left the auction after Harlan's bid. And now, whispers of Sterling Drax were surfacing again. He'd been circling ranches like a vulture, buying cheap land from men too proud to admit defeat. Back at the ranch, Briar returned with medical supplies and concern etched on her face. "I heard Drax was asking around. Someone said he was in Copper Ridge last week." Harlan nodded grimly. He always knew how to smell blood. Briar looked at Tucker. If he's coming for the land, you need to prepare. Tucker exhaled hard. We don't have time. We don't have money. And we don't have allies. Harlan looked up slowly. Maybe we have something better. That afternoon, Mournridge galloped across the smaller paddock, his first run since returning. His legs were shaky, but determination burned in his muscles. Tucker and Briar watched in silence. The horse wasn't just recovering. He was remembering who he was. If the county fair is still running next month, Briar said carefully, and if he's strong enough, Tucker shook his head, almost laughing. You think winning a local show is going to stop Drax from taking everything? Briar looked him in the eye. No. But it might remind people what this place used to be. Just before sundown, a black SUV pulled up at the ranch gate. The windows were tinted, the engine too quiet. Harlan and Tucker stood on the porch as the driver stepped out. Tall, clean-cut, with a polished belt buckle that gleamed even in the dying light, Sterling Drax. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Evening, gentlemen," he said smoothly. "Heard you had something of mine running around your property." Tucker felt his chest tighten, his fists clench. And beside him, Harlan didn't blink. The past had finally come knocking, and it wore a suit. Sterling Drax walked through the front gate like he owned it. The silence on the ranch grew heavier with every step he took toward the porch. His boots barely made a sound on the gravel, but his presence thundered through the air. "I come bearing opportunity," he said, spreading his arms slightly. Harlan didn't flinch. Tucker stayed one step behind him, jaw tight. "We're not selling," Tucker said flatly. Drax chuckled. "I haven't made an offer yet." His smile was polished, but Tucker could see the greed behind it. They moved inside. Harlan insisted they sit at the old oak kitchen table, the same one Evelyn had served Sunday dinners on. The irony wasn't lost on him. Drax removed a sleek leather folder from his coat and laid it on the table like a loaded weapon. Inside, copies of liens, overdue tax statements, legal notices, and a purchase agreement. "I'm offering above market value," Drax said casually. "You'd be fools not to consider." Harlan stared at the papers without touching them. "You've been planning this a long time." Drax nodded. 12 years, give or take. Briar arrived mid-meeting, catching sight of Drax through the kitchen window. Her expression turned cold. She knew exactly who he was, and what he wanted. Stepping inside, she placed herself beside Tucker without a word, her presence a quiet wall of support. Drax noticed and smirked. "Ah, the veterinarian. You still believe horses make people better?" Briar didn't flinch. "Sometimes they're the only thing that can." Drax's smile faded just slightly. Harlan finally spoke. "You waited until the right moment, until I was too old, too tired, and too buried in regret to fight back." Drax leaned forward. "Exactly. You were legendary once, Creed. But legends don't pay bills." He pushed the agreement closer. "Sign it, walk away with dignity." Tucker's fists clenched on the table. Harlan looked at his grandson, then at the folded photo of Evelyn still sitting by the window. Her smile seemed to speak louder than anything in the room. "No deal," Harlan said, his voice steady, final. "This land isn't for sale. Not to you. Not ever." Drax's jaw tensed. He stood slowly, collecting his papers. "Then I'll see you in court," he said, voice flat. "And I'll win." He turned and walked out without another word, his SUV vanishing down the road like a shadow slipping back into the trees. That night, the ranch was quiet again, too quiet. Mournridge stood near the fence, ears alert, as if sensing what was coming. Tucker knew they had little time. But deep inside, something had shifted. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were preparing for war. The next morning broke with a thin layer of fog rolling over the fields. The ranch felt suspended in time, holding its breath. Tucker stood by the barn, watching Mournridge as Briar tightened the saddle straps with care. "You really think he's ready?" he asked. Briar looked up, calm but focused. "He's not just ready, Tucker. He needs this." In the distance, the county fairgrounds were already stirring. The event wasn't just a local attraction this year. With news of Mournridge's return spreading fast, the media had shown up, and with them, attention that might be enough to turn the tide. Harlan rolled up beside them, dressed in his old denim jacket, a clean white hat resting firmly on his head. "Let me do this," he said. Tucker shook his head. "You can't ride." Harlan gave a quiet smile. "I don't need to. But I can walk him into the ring. Let them see who he is and who we are." Tucker hesitated, then nodded. The sight of his grandfather, weathered but unbroken, walking alongside that horse would say more than any court case ever could. At the fairgrounds, the atmosphere buzzed with tension and curiosity. Spectators leaned over fences, cameras flashed, and whispers filled the air as Mournridge entered the arena. His coat, once dull and caked in mud, now shone under the sun. The scar beneath his right eye was still there, a silent badge of everything he'd survived. Harlan walked beside him slowly, his hand on the lead rope, his spine straight. For a moment, time folded, and the boy he once was, the man Evelyn had loved, returned. As the announcer called Mournridge's name, a hush fell. Then a wave of applause rolled over the crowd, not just for the horse, but for what he represented: resilience, memory, redemption. In the stands, Sterling Drax watched with clenched jaw. He hadn't expected this. Not the crowd, not the cameras, and certainly not the story turning against him. Rhett Crowley sat beside him, silent, guilt slowly eroding the armor of pride he'd worn for years. Tucker stepped into the ring and took the reins. With a nod from Briar, he climbed into the saddle. Mournridge didn't flinch. He moved like he remembered, proud, purposeful. Tucker guided him in a slow, deliberate trot around the arena. The crowd rose to their feet. For the first time, Tucker felt what his grandfather had always talked about: the bond between man and horse, and something deeper, legacy. And somewhere beyond the cheers and flashing cameras, Evelyn's spirit seemed to move with them, quiet and proud. The moment wasn't just for the crowd. It was for the Creed name, and the fight wasn't over yet. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread fast after the fair. Photos of Mournridge and Tucker had gone viral, headlines calling it the return of the ghost horse. But beyond the publicity, the stakes were painfully real. Inside, Tucker sat beside Harlan at the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Sterling Drax adjusted his cufflinks, the picture of composure. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. This wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It had become a symbol, and symbols were harder to crush. The judge, an older woman with a sharp voice and tired eyes, called the room to order. Over the next hour, lawyers traded documents, arguments, and numbers. But then came the moment that changed everything. Briar took the stand. Calm, clear, and resolute, she described the state Mournridge had been in, the emotional toll on the Creed family, and the significance of the horse's return. "You can't measure grief," she said softly. "But you can honor it. That's what this fight is about." Then came Rhett Crowley. To everyone's surprise, he asked to testify. With trembling hands, he admitted to the cover-up. "I let Harlan believe the horse was better off away. I thought I was helping. I wasn't. I was just protecting myself." There were gasps in the room, but Harlan didn't react. He just lowered his head slightly, as if he'd already forgiven Rhett long before this day. Tucker placed a hand on his grandfather's arm. "It's done," he whispered. And it was. The judge deliberated for nearly an hour before returning with her verdict. The lien would be dismissed. The Creed ranch would remain under Harlan's name. The crowd erupted. Drax stood, quietly furious, and walked out without a word. His shadow no longer loomed, not over the land, not over their lives. Back at the ranch, the family gathered for dinner. Nothing fancy, just cornbread, roast beef, and strong coffee. But there was laughter now, and light in Harlan's eyes that hadn't been there in years. Mournridge stood in the pasture, his silhouette glowing under the setting sun. Tucker leaned against the fence, watching. "Think he knows?" he asked. Harlan joined him. "He knows. He always did." They stood in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because no words were needed any more. As the last light faded and the wind whispered through the tall grass, one truth remained. They hadn't just saved a horse. They had reclaimed a legacy. And in doing so, they had healed something far older than any wound. They had come home.